Everyone, please rise. We're going to ask Mr. Brown to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Before we get seated tonight, can I ask for a moment of silence in recognition of the victims of the Paris terrorist attacks and good thoughts towards the whole world at this point who's dealing with this terrorism epidemic. Thank you. And welcome everyone to the first quarterly meeting of the new fiscal year. Tonight's agenda, we're going to have a quick private executive session to review some personnel matters. We're going to review the abbreviated Board of Education quarterly fiscal Q1 fiscal 2016 financial position. That is a paper report. We are not going to have a representative from the Board of Education, or rather the Education Administration, here tonight. If we have any questions, we can actually submit those directly to them, and they'll get back to us. But they did send along a report for us. Again, this is part of our trying to speed along the first quarter review here.
Tom, that's like the second time that they haven't come to one of our quarterlies. And this has got to really, I mean...
No, Jim, in this instance, they asked. This was not...
well, whether they asked or not, I don't think it's too much to ask that they have a representative here.
That's fine.
For a quarterly meeting. I'd like to not be here either. I've got other things to do for the holiday myself. But, you know, I'm here. And the difference is I'm not getting paid to be here, and they're all being paid.
That's not fair to them on this one, because they called and asked. They asked if we wanted them there tonight. Mr. Mayor and I talked to them about the abbreviated agenda for the first quarterly review. So if we wanted them here, if Mr. Mayor and I wanted them here tonight, they were going to come. So this was not them saying we want to beg off, in all fairness to them.
Well, in fairness to us as members, I spent some time, I took some notes on questions that I have, so now that time is all wasted. So
let's submit them in writing.
I'd rather them come, and I'd rather the next time we have a meeting, they be here so we can ask the questions.
That's fine. All right, item number 3 is to review the current status of the town's pension and OPEB funds. Item 4 is to review an abbreviated schedule on the town's financial position at the end of Q1. And the last item is to hear a report from the Budget Committee from Mr. Brown on some improvements we're going to make for the 2016 budget process. Anybody have any other questions, comments, concerns on the agenda for tonight? Seeing none, can I have a motion to go into private executive session? Mr. DeWitt, do I have a second? Mr. Brown, all in favor? Opposed, abstentions, let's go out back. Do we have a motion to come out of private executive session? Mr. DeWitt, do I have a second? Mr. Brown, all in favor of coming out? Opposed, abstentions, we are now back in public session. Item number 1, to review the abbreviated Board of Education Q1 financial position. They submitted a paper report on this.
I'm going to make a motion to postpone this to our next regularly scheduled meeting, since they're not available.
Do we have a second on that? Mr. Brown? Okay, let's take a vote on this. All in favor? Go ahead.
Get it just for one quick second.
Well, we have a motion on the floor, Chris.
Okay.
All in favor of postponing this to our meeting next week? Opposed? Abstentions? We can postpone it. Thank you, Mr. DeWitt. Thank you. Okay, so item number 3, to review the current state of the town's pension and OPEB funds. Mr. McCarthy Vahey here. Or Mr. Vahey here. Mr. McCarthy. Yeah. Slipped there. Right, he said he was going to be here. Mr. Mayor, do you want to walk us through the reports? As you serve on the committees? And I will say that Mr. Vahey did indicate that he would be here. There was correspondence between us and himself last week. Go ahead, Mr. Mayor.
As you may or may not remember, the OPEB is strictly in passive investments. The Vanguard U.S. Stock Fund, the Wilshire 500, and the Vanguard International Blended Benchmark. We did better for the last 3 months than the OPEB benchmark, which is the Russell 300 plus the Barclays Aggregate Index, et cetera. But as you can see there, the last month, the fund lost, last month being, this is September 30th we're looking at, right? So I don't know if Jennifer sent out June as well. But
No, we did June last quarter.
right.
What you're saying is the OPEB total, the benchmark versus the benchmark fiscal year to date
Yeah,
is
so
a negative 6.13. We're at a negative 5.92. So essentially,
Right.
we're right at the benchmark,
yeah.
correct?
Well, a little bit better, but not significantly better, yes.
And for the last
if you go for last quarter, if you look at it for last quarter, the last month, the last year, the last 36 months, we're actually below the benchmark for the last 36 months, a little bit above the benchmark for the last 60 months.
And again, immaterial differences.
Right. Right. Not a great market. October was a really good month. I think the market was up like 7%. So we'll hopefully see some better numbers coming next quarter. We
Can we
haven't.
Can we turn to the asset allocation then?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so if we look at the asset allocation, with the exception of fixed income, where we're a couple percentage points above, we are at the target investment amount for U.S. stocks, international stocks. Fixed income, we're a little bit higher. And then, of course, we have a little over 1% in cash.
Right, and we, the town made its OPEB contribution in October. Couple $1 million, also invested the $247,000 there in cash. And with that contribution and the investment acquisitions, came basically at that date right in line with the target percentages. Probably not the next day, but that specific date.
Do we have any questions on OPEB on either asset allocations or return on investment?
At what point, I think Mr. Vahey stated the last time at what point we would go to a more active managed account, so similar, and have allocations similar to the pension plans. What number are we trying to get to before we do that?
That there is not a number. There's opinions on the board on what that number should be. My opinion is 50 million. Other people have higher numbers, and other people have lower numbers.
Okay.
He did, to Mr. Walsh's point, though, Mr. Vahey did quote a number that he thought that they could do active investment.
Right. That was his opinion number. Right. Not there has
He
not
didn't
been voted.
I don't think he expressed it in that.
Yeah, it has not been voted on by the board.
Okay, so what's the current discussions amongst the board?
That's what I'm saying. My number is 50 million. Some people are 30. Some people are 40.
Is
Some
this an
people are-
active conversation, or is this just being put on the back burner because no one wants to talk about it?
No, it's an active conversation. I mean, nobody wants to go now.
Okay.
There's nobody at this level that thinks it's reasonable.
So you're waiting to get up to the $30 million level?
Probably become more active, but it is discussed, even though we're still at the 22. I mean, it's a pretty freewheeling board, and people bring up their topics, and some people are very passive oriented. As you know, Ken Brackfield's on the board now, and some people are very active oriented. So we have a range of opinions.
Mr. Walsh, okay?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Just, again, we do have a goal for a discount rate, correct? Whether we have 20 million or 50 million, which I believe is 7.5%?
That is correct.
Okay. So these asset distributions, is there discussion on what can get us to 7.5%? Over
Yeah,
past
the
60
asset
months-
allocation, the asset allocation is based upon that calculation.
Okay, okay. So over the last 60 months, we're at 3.7%. So is there any discussion on the asset allocation themselves?
Well, the asset allocation is, yeah, we look at that every year in depth, and the asset allocation is based upon a long timeline, you know, your 30, 40, 50-year timeline. And it's reviewed and approved and signed off on by the auditors as well and the actuaries as being reasonable or not. And that is actively evaluated pretty aggressively annually.
Okay, thank you.
You all set, Mr. Brown? Anybody else? Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Let's go through to the pension fund, please.
If you want to start on the page 1 of the numbers, the target asset distribution page, we did sell, again in October, I sold $4 million of the BlackRock, which, as you can see there, was, you know, the domestic equity was really, moving outside the target range. And, you know, the target range theoretically, well, the target is a target, the target range is plus or minus 5% of the target. And you can see that was getting very, very close to the upper limit of the target range. So we took $4 million out of BlackRock, and we put it in TA Realty, which you can see down below, was only at 1.29%. Excuse me, we put it in tapped commodity, which we were at 1.94%, where it should be 3%. So we increased that up to 10 million, so it's close to its 3% range.
Okay, so
So
if
we
we do that,
made that adjustment.
we do that for a snapshot in time, almost all the other investments in terms of investment mix are at the target or
Right.
just about at the target.
Pretty close.
And then there's a few that are at the 10% mark, the only one that's over the 10% mark in as opposed to the target of no more than 10% with any one investment is BlackRock. Is that correct?
Yes. But the investment guidelines, if I recall correctly, exclude the index funds from those parameters and constraints.
Does anybody have any question about the asset allocation amongst the investment managers or type of investments? Okay. Seeing none, we'll go to the returns for the period.
Yeah, if you want to go to the last page.
Yep.
To get to the total.
Yep, sure.
That's the more interesting number, right? As you can see, again, total fund for the month down 2 points, fiscal year to date down 7 points, last 12 months down 1, last 36 months 7, and last 5 years 8, up 8.13. Again, October is probably a really good month. I haven't seen the October numbers for our accounts, but as I indicated earlier, the U.S. stock market was up 6-7 points in October. So, and the emergency markets were up a little bit as well. So it was a good month. So.
Questions, Mr. Walsh?
I thought Mr. Vahey said the last time we were here 2 months ago that we were getting killed in commodities. So why would we take money out of BlackRock, even though we were slightly above, and throw it at commodities just to hit the target? Even though we know for the year that commodities have been getting killed?
Yeah, I mean, commodities are down, I think, like 25% or something in the last, last year. But it is, you can't, it's really interesting, some of the conversations at the board. You go through a very thorough analysis, develop an asset allocation based upon a target return rate, and then you sit in the room and say, well, we're not at our target, but geez, I don't know if it's doing very well, but, so that goes back and forth. But the intent here was, we do the work, the targets are developed based upon long-term activity, potential, and history. And so the purpose was to, not because anybody said commodities are coming back, so to speak, but that we needed to be within our target ranges.
I understand the target ranges. It just seemed, I mean, I'm not an expert. I have to rely on people like Brian and other people for that, because that's not my specialty. But it just seems to me that I understood we were going over on the equities, and specifically in regards to BlackRock. But some of these other areas that seem to be kind of making money, you throw each one of them a point or something so that they're not out of whack either, as opposed to, for the last 12 months, commodities have been off 27%, the last month 4%, the last fiscal year 14.69. It seems like that the time could have just at least waited for slightly better for things maybe to turn around in those markets.
I think there was a building committee meeting at the same night as the last pension plan meeting, with the pension plan meeting when that decision was made. And I was at the building committee, Penfield Building Committee, and I was not at the meeting when the decision was made. I was at the Penfield Building Committee.
Okay.
Are there minutes kept to those meetings?
Yes.
Can you follow up and just see what the discussion was surrounding that, just so that we're better informed?
Sure.
Maybe there was a discussion over whether that market had hit a bottom and it was going to, in their view, was going to improve. Just to know whether that was truly about hitting the target, or if they had some
Yep.
views. Does that make sense, Mr. Walsh?
Yeah, it just seems, after hearing the discussion on how we were getting killed in commodities, I was surprised to see that we take money out of BlackRock, which is profitable, and I understand taking it out because we're over, but there's other areas we could have spread it out on that were more, at least temporarily profitable. I mean, I understand we're a long-term investor, so I do understand that.
Yeah.
It just seems that commodities have been getting killed for the last year, and there doesn't seem to be a turnaround at this point in time.
Yeah, I will investigate that, and I'll just distribute something to the board.
Yeah, thank you. So if we can get a follow-up on that, and then we do, following up on our item from before, we do need to ask the superintendent if he can come next Tuesday night to talk about the variances.
And if you guys can talk to Mr. Vahey the next time, because this is now out of the last 4 meetings, or last quarterly meetings, this is now the second meeting out of 4.
We have a meeting, we have a series of
Not attended.
emails, him confirming that he was going to be here tonight.
It just seems odd.
Yep. I agree. Any other questions, comments on OPEB or pension? Seeing none, let's go on to item number 4, which is the abbreviated discussion of the town's financial position as of the end of the first quarter of fiscal year 2016. I'll turn it back over to Mr. Mayor and welcome Mrs. Bossy.
The process of developing these schedules, variance analysis every quarter is a very excellent management tool as well as an information piece for this board. It forces the department heads to go through their accounts and identify areas where they see where the numbers aren't in line with anticipation and expectation, and to evaluate why, how come, what for, and to make adjustments as appropriate. We did not want to, though I totally agree with the abbreviation process, we didn't want to totally release or not go through that process. So we did go through the process. We communicated with all the department heads. We asked them some specific questions regarding their, where they were and where they aren't. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Bossy.
Okay, if you guys want to start with the page labeled projected net estimated variance, which is the usual summary sheet you guys, I think, are used to seeing.
Yep.
Only a few numbers on the revenue side. First and foremost, which is driving our negative variance so far this year, is the state revenue. There's a Exhibit A that backs up the negative 481 that we're projecting as of now. The biggest piece of which is the pilot payment for the college and the hospitals from the state. That has actually arrived, so we did receive the $2,024,000, and the budget was the 2.5, so that's driving, that's virtually the whole variance of the 480, falling down with a few more ins and outs after that. So that's the biggest driver on this whole sheet right now. The second revenue item is the Park and Rec revenue of the 45, which is a favorable, which is a combination of two items. It's a negative for Penfield and a variance on the transfer of funds from the rec trust account that happens on September 30th of every year. So that is actually a negative 70 combined with a favorable 115 to make up a favorable 45 for the Park and Rec revenue number, which subtotals the negative variance on the revenue of the 436. On the expense side, we have a couple items that we know about so far, so we wanted to let you guys know. There's an unemployment comp issue of about 20 to 25 as of now. The actual is about 20 over budget. We're being conservative with the extra 5, so there's about 25 negative there. Heart and hypertension, a favorable 200, like there was a favorability last year, due to, I think, classes and favorable claims experience on the heart and hypertension.
How is that estimated, that 200, Caitlin?
Really, it was a favorable 300 last year, and we took the actual so far this year, and we projected out what we paid out last year, and 200 might be a little bit conservative, but 200 is where we think we're going to come in. Last year, it was exactly 298 favorable. On the electricity piece, we can come back to that in one quick second, because Joe Michelangelo and Ed Bowman are here. Penfield, on the other side of the equation of the negative revenue piece, there was about a 20,000 savings on the expense side due to salaries, contracted services, and a little bit in marketing. And 155 on vacancies.
So what is that? What does that represent?
There's 4 different departments that we know of as of now. There's a town clerk, has some vacancies, Park and Rec up at Smith Rich, ECC, and the library. I believe that's a children's librarian.
And what does the 155 represent? How is that calculated? Is that a projected annual savings? Is that
Yes,
already?
annual.
That's annual based on,
Based on, as we know of now, how many weeks it's been open.
okay, but I guess what I'm trying to get is that what it, Dave, you can come on up. Is it supposed to be, is it annualized? In other words, are you projecting additional savings, or is this already savings that we have through the first quarter? Do you know what I'm saying?
Some of which have been vacant for a couple of weeks already, and they know that they're in the process of hiring, so they've estimated a salary and a higher week.
Okay,
So it is an annualized projected number.
okay. So it's not in the bank. It's essentially, things can change. It's an assumption based on best
There
available
could be few weeks
information.
that have already been in the bank, but yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Before we go to the electricity item, is there any other questions, comments, or concerns on these items?
Before we go to what? The revenue?
The electricity.
Oh.
They have-
Well, I mean, I think the state revenue thing is a little concerning with the pilot, or the way, I guess, the governor and legislature cut that pilot program, because it's gonna, something we gotta pay attention to as we go forward with whatever happens with GE, because if that property's ever taken over by a university such as Sacred Heart, we're seeing where they're willing to go to right away is to cut that pilot money, which we would get some funds on, not full reimbursement of our $1.8 million of lost taxes, but, you know, they seem to go there right away.
Good point. Is there any other areas you're monitoring and are concerned about right now, Mr. Mayor and Mrs. Blasi, or is everything going kind of according to plan right now?
This is everything that's on my radar. I don't know, Bob, if you want to.
The taxes looking fine, revenues looking fine. I mean, no negatives, tiny positives, not enough to count on anything.
All right, so this, and this negative 337 that we're looking at right now, just so that we put it into context, and we'll get to the discussion of the electricity issue in one minute. That includes the first adjustment to the state budget, but as we know, they're in discussions now about adjusting the state budget yet again.
That is a correct statement, and the governor's budget that's been put out there has the total state revenue adjustment equal to the original. So in the pilot program, we actually had a savings in another state grant. Not a savings, but greater revenue, positive variance, and that was like 512. So, but our pilot was a negative 512. So if it is the same number, if they allocate it the same way, you can add 512 to that.
Okay, so we have a potential budget hole pending that item of about $849,000, correct?
Correct.
Largely driven by adjustments at the state level. In fact, entirely driven by adjustments at the state level from a grant perspective.
Correct.
So when, we'll know that by the time we do the next quarterly, and if we have problems covering that hole, or you'll come back to us with how we're going to cover that hole.
Correct. Yeah. In the interim, we're looking at delayed hirings or putting a soft freeze on hirings and discretionary spending and that type of thing while we are laying in wait for the state action.
Okay. And remind us again, in the contingency we have,
475 in our normal contingency.
thank you. Any other questions before we go? Mrs. Leclerc?
Just explain how the pilot is calculated and like how the state allocates it to us. I
don't know if it's different for different economic level communities or not. I know that we get about 30% of what the tax would be for the assessed value of nonprofit, tax-exempt properties.
Mr. Tetra, did you want to add to that explanation?
If I might, I think it's closer to 24% that we get from 24. If you figured out what we should get for the pilot program, we're being funded like most towns at about 24% of that. In this past budget, they went through and looked at segregating certain of the cities that had a greater need or not as financially well off, and redirected some money to them so they get a higher portion of that. When you look at the amount of the budget that New Haven, Hartford, Bridgeport, in terms of the percent of their grand list that is in pilot, you saw in this most recent budget that the State Assembly started to make some adjustments or redirect funding based on the percentage of your grand list that was tied into not-for-profit or that might be covered by pilot money. I do not have all the formulas off the top of my head. I think somewhere in there's probably some massaging that goes on in addition to that.
Okay, thank you.
You all set, Mrs. Leclerc? Mr. DeWitt?
Thank you. I can't believe this, that I'm asking this question after 8 years of looking at these numbers, but what's the threshold that, like the cutoff for numbers on this list? So what I'm getting at is, there's not 300 departments with $1,000 savings. You wouldn't report that, obviously. Is it like 20,000? Is that as low as you'd go? Or,
Well, the
or high
actual,
as you go?
the detailed report
Yep.
that we normally do, this is
Right.
the first time we've done a little bit of a summary one, has a 10,000 and 10% threshold on
10,000.
every account.
Oh, okay.
So what makes this summary is a little bit subjective. The bigger items, things that we think you guys should know about. I
Right.
only put the 20 for the Penfield on because it was in the revenue side, so I wanted to show that there was some offset in savings.
Yeah.
On the expense side as well. This summary's a little bit, but the detailed report has the actual 10,000 and 10% that was set by the reporting subcommittee of this board.
Got it. Okay. No, thank you.
Any other questions? Mr. Matola?
Just for my clarification, so this is my first quarterly review. In past years, we used to have all the department heads here to ask them questions. Is that what we used to do? And I know we had a discussion at one of our last meetings that we thought that was kind of a waste of time.
We've actually we've run the gamut through so I've been here a decade.
Okay.
And sometimes we would have department heads here, specifically we have DPW here tonight to talk about this electricity issue. Other times we've had written responses Mrs. Gardner has put together through working with the department heads, written responses. We also had a report committee that came up and kind of, when I first got here, we used to go through literally line item by line item through the general ledger. Then we started having Mrs. Gardner work with the department heads and come up with variance analysis on the key ones. Then we went, as Mrs. Bossy said, to kind of this threshold through a reports committee and did 10 and 10, right? As Mr. Walsh pointed out in one of our earlier meetings of which you're alluding to, at this time of year, most of the commentary that we got was related to timing differences. They would encumber all the salary accounts. So salary would look like it was way over budget or what have you, and would say, oh, that's just timing. And really, this meeting becomes more meaningful actually at about the next meeting.
Right.
In January,
Okay.
when there's actually the timing differences are mostly flushed out, and the finance department has a better handle on what our issues are with state revenue, what our tax collection rate is, what the winter has thrown at us, what we've utilized in contingency. And actually, one of the other drivers has been what the vacancies have been in certain of the departments where we've had to have overtime, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been an evolving process, and I wouldn't say we've actually got it 100% right. I don't think we've messed it up too badly, but I think we could always get better. So any explanations, or rather any suggestions, cheerfully received to get better at this.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Mr.
This is
Walsh?
more of a comment. I think we should talk about whether we want to still do this first quarter. I still think that's a question that we should think about. And just looking back historically, I looked at like last year what we were looking at, and we looked like we were going to have I think a little over $200,000 surplus, and we ended up with a $3 million surplus. So it's way too early, I think, sometimes on this to get a full handle of what is really going on. And I guess we looks like 337 negative here. This could completely change around or get dramatically worse by
Yep.
the second quarter. So I don't know, maybe we should talk about this later at another meeting about whether we want to continue this first quarter meeting.
Well, I think it's perfectly appropriate for the next meeting when we're setting the calendar for next year. And I would remind you, just on the flip side of that, and actually, I don't know if you might have been on the RTM at the time. We did, I know Mr. Tetra was on this board at the time. We did actually have to have an emergency meeting in December of one year.
2008.
Yeah, I know Mr. DeWitt and Mrs. Leclerc, and you I think were here too, Jim, where things became readily apparent during the financial meltdown that we were going to have somewhat of a crisis situation. So the first selectman, actually, Mr. Flato, asked us to meet in an emergency meeting right before the Christmas holidays to actually review the financial position and tell us what steps he recommended we take in order to mitigate some things that we found out were happening in the broader economy as a whole at that time. So, Mr. DeWitt?
Just one other point I wanted to bring up about, because I'm an advocate of doing it in the first quarter, just having that look. When we first started having real discussions about this, it was pre-Munis. The old system, I don't even remember the name of it,
Phoenix.
did not do a good job of spreading out the budget, right, reallocating. And
That's right.
and there was a lot more of this, you know, it's the 11th month of the fiscal year, and everything shot up, right? So Munis did help us level set a recurring kind of a level setting, for a one-time fee at the end of the year, or one-time expense. So I'm still in favor of having this kind of discussion, but I do agree with Mr. Walsh. The number we looked at last year at this time was, okay, and then it got really okay at the end of the year, right? So.
And one of the things, thank you, Mr. DeWitt, one of the things we talked about last meeting when this was brought up was focusing on some other core items at this meeting as opposed to just the financial position. And Mr. Mayor, Mr. Becker elicited it earlier this week. We had talked about it last meeting, having a discussion of where the bonded programs are right now, or where the bonded items are, and the closeouts and what the status of those were, particularly as the audit committee is going to go into finalizing the audit report for December 31st. So, Mr. Mayor, where do we stand with that?
We actually are have been planning to have you on your December 1st meeting.
It's supposed to be this meeting.
No, the deauthorization vote
Okay.
of items, which is something we started, 2 years ago, and just didn't have the time or resources to get to it. We worked hard. It's to try to get a document ready for tonight. With everything else that's going on, it just didn't happen. I apologize for that. And some of them, you have to go back in history. We have things on the books, before 1999. We don't have, minor things, small things. So just to get, we put together a truncated schedule, actually, today. But in looking at it, it raises, more questions that we don't have answers for. So it just didn't make sense to go into it. But we'll should have it all ready for you guys next week.
Mr. Becker?
Yeah, no, and I think that it certainly makes sense and is fine, and actually is sort of some of what you're mentioning is one of the reasons why I brought that up after that last the deauthorization that raised some questions, and so the deauthorization I think raised some questions, and now obviously as you go in to look at it, even it's raising some questions for you. And I always sort of say, we talk about the budgets, those are the big things. We have a lot of money that gets spent and is sort of sitting out there in the bonding. So be it December or if it takes you longer, it certainly, appeases, the question I had. So just making sure that we're taking that look.
I'm on. When we first started this, that's when we found out that information about that whole paving thing, which ended up creating, a lot of work.
So what we want to do is we want to transition, if we keep the quarterly meeting, we want to transition the first quarterly meeting to look at these quote-unquote ancillary items, for lack of a better term, than just how we're doing through the first quarter, but all the cleanup items, and it's particularly good to look at those items before we get into the budget process. Things where these bonding resolutions are, where these closeouts are, what authorizations or deauthorizations need to happen, where we stand on the pension and the OPEB. These are all the items that basically good governance would say that we look at these items so that they're fresh in our minds, because we're only a couple months away from going into the budget process. And these are all balance sheet and other items that wouldn't necessarily come before us in the operating budget, but might play a role as to how we vote on the operating budget.
And I totally agree, totally understand.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor, could I just ask you to think about before that next meeting, what do you think the amount of town resources were to get to this for the first quarter? I'm talking about going to department heads and just, I know it's hard to say because you don't know how many hours people worked on it, but sometimes I think it's good to know, for us to know how much, some type of sense of what kind of resources went into, maybe we'll decide it's not worth it.
It's a good, as I mentioned earlier, it's also a good management tool. It forces the managers to look at their books and records and see what's going on and alert them to any issues. So
So
I
you're in
think it's-
favor of continuing it?
Yes, sir.
Any other questions, comments? Good dialogue. Appreciate it. We can always get better at our process, so I look forward to the discussion at next meeting. Mrs. Bossy, did you
I
have
just want you to
anything
keep
add?
one thing in mind, that even though that, the schedule that's in the annual report has a lot of old projects that I know you
Yep.
want to see closed, Tom, every year, we want to see them closed. The state,
You got to admire my consistency.
your determination is admirable. The state is now just talking about Tomlinson. So you have to understand that all those school
Yep.
projects since Tomlinson have to remain on that list until the state comes in to audit.
Yep.
So until that time, we can't close them. So there's probably, with all the continuing projects going on now with Osborne and Ludlow and Riverfield and the newer stuff, there's probably 8 to 10 projects that you're going to sit there and go, why are they still on the list? But I
Yep.
just want you to be aware, that goes back to what, 03, 04, 05. So from that point forward, we can't close any of them.
Are you saying the state is behind in something?
No, but I'm
Okay.
stating the facts that
Thank you.
until that time, we just can't. So.
Understand. It's sad, but it's acceptable. Mr. Mayor, did you have something you wanted to say?
Not really. The only thing I would add to that is what we are doing is, there's 4 classes right now. There's authorizations that need to be deauthorized. There's authorizations, there's projects that are completed, but as Ms. Bos just indicated, are waiting for the audit. And then there's projects that are in progress. And then there's probably some we're not sure about.
Okay.
But yeah, so, yeah, it'll be clear when you get the list, the schedule.
And we'll have that next week?
Yes. It's the
Thank you.
goal.
Mrs. Leclerc, you had something.
Yeah, I have a question, and I don't know if you're able to answer it tonight or next week would be fine also. But recently, we got our assessment notices in the mail. So I was just wondering, because we set the mill rate, if you could give us an idea of how the change in the grand list affects, like, the current mill rate, so we know.
Yeah, a very quick overview, Mr. Leclerc. The total grand list change is minus 1.9%.
Over last year.
Right.
Okay.
That's in the aggregate. 50% went down, 40% went up, 10% stayed about the same.
Total, it's about.
Total, now that minus is 1.9% is only real estate. We have not concluded our work on personal property or motor vehicle expectations yet. And as you know, we don't get the, what do you call it, the supplemental voter vehicles until, I don't even remember when, like March or April. So, yeah, so the 1.9 is a preliminary number.
Can I follow up on that, Mrs. Leclerc? It's an excellent point and something that I thought of for our next quarterly meeting. I just got my notices. I believe everybody just got theirs. Can we get a brief presentation on the reassessment, the process and the results? Any lessons learned on the assessment process that was just completed? Can we get that for our next quarterly meeting, please?
Sure. Yeah, we did a couple of things differently this year, as you know.
Yep.
This board voted on a full assessment, number one. Number two, we had 10 town meetings.
Yep.
Which was 5 like early on, letting people know what was going on, et cetera, what to expect, and then 5 explaining the next processes. We have, we're going to putting on the website what you do next, and part of that was in the press release, if you saw the press release.
Yes.
So far, I wasn't here the last time, but based upon what I've heard, we've had some compliments that have come in from people. The process, the result, even, so right now, knock on wood, we're thinking that we're going to have, it's been received well, divided up into, but yes, we'll do that for the next stuff.
Yeah, I'd like to
We'll have
understand.
more of a history then, too, about what really,
Well, and that's why I wanted, and quite frankly, that's why I wanted to give it some time.
yeah.
That's why I didn't think it appropriate for tonight's meeting. But at the end of the next quarter, so late January, when we have this,
Yeah.
and we're only talking a few minutes to go through, here's what we did, here's how it came out, here was the impact on the grand list, to Ms. Leclerc's point, here's the impact on the average taxpayer. If there was any surprises, any gotchas, anything that was interesting that they found during the course of their review across the town, that would be interesting to note. We do have a role to play in that we finance this. We are responsible for putting in what the process is. So I think having just a summary report as to how it all went would be appropriate. Does anyone disagree with that?
The only thing that I question is whether we should move that meeting up, because people have to, I thought the date was by the end of February, file their appeal. Is that date not correct?
Correct.
So they have till February 28th, and we're going to be having a meeting in late January.
January.
And
That's our next quarter.
I was wondering whether we should move the process up, because I think I've talked to a number of people who've asked me, I've gone down, is that a good thing? I go, well, I don't know how much the average went down. If you're more than the average, it's a good thing. Until I heard some of these numbers here tonight, I mean, it would be almost interesting if we could get a presentation on the real estate side so that the public could hear that conversation
We can,
earlier.
we can do it in
December.
early January. We have one meeting in December, which is next week, which we have to give them time to put together the presentation,
Thank you, sir.
right? And next week, we are getting a relatively full agenda at this point, right? With what we have.
Yeah, we have Penfield.
Right.
We have bonds.
We have Penfield, we have the authorization on the bonds, we have the organizational meeting.
Right.
We now have the Board of Education review. We can do this in the January 4th meeting.
Yeah, that might
or,
make sense.
Somewhere in the early January meeting, which is another voting night, but we don't know what that agenda looks like at this point in time, but it's certainly doable.
Mhm.
Did you, yeah, Mr. Becker, I'm sorry, I barely saw your hand there.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think this would be good for us to do. I mean, yes, we finance it, but also there's provisions of the charter that lay this actually right at our feet as a board, which makes it even more important that we kind of follow through on that other end. I agree on the timeline. The only one thing that I've seen floating out there now, and maybe it would be helpful, and if I've missed it, if the town has done this, fine, but if not, it seemed that in the as the numbers came down, about a week ago, it sort of said, and essentially next year you'll get your tax bill and you'll see what your taxes are, and it didn't give much of a tool for people to understand what this really does to their own individual bill. So I'm not sure on the town side if maybe if there's a way to create a calculator, maybe the assessor's office can do this, to let somebody know if this is where you were, if nothing changed other than this new grand list and these new values, what someone's bill would be. So they could go, my bill is $8,000 this year, and had I had this value, it would have been $8,500 or $6,500, whatever the number may be. I think it's very hard for people to kind of put wrap their arms around it, because there's a lot of moving parts. And currently there are some things out there from other organizations that are sort of saying if you're plus this, it'll be plus this on your tax. And, I think the town, if they can do it, the town probably can do it, and maybe even, I'm not saying they're inaccurate or not, but bring some certainty to some people on that, being that it comes from the town. So I know it's a bit of an ask, but I'm putting the concept out there, because I think what we don't want is people to get into this uncertainty and rumor and all of that all the way out until next July, worrying about what their bill may be if they swung. And clearly a lot of people have got variances. I mean, I didn't adjust much, but I've got a neighbor that had a large amount who then comes to me and says, hey, what's going on with this? to which I personally don't have much of a response to, because it's all, relative to their own
I mean, it's
situation.
I mean, it's an interesting concept. It's easy to put together a matrix. I can easily visualize the matrix. If your taxes went up, down this much, here's the impact if taxes stay the same, if there's no change in the budget. And I don't know what the opinions of people might be if they would really want to put that up there, but I could build one.
You can, Mr. Mottola.
I think it's important that we're going to have some type of a presentation that it's really extremely focused on what the process was. And I thought the intent of having this type of a presentation was for the board to get an update on how our financial people thought that the process went and why it was better this time around than compared to, what was it, 5 years ago? Because it almost sounds like, I don't want to say this, but it almost sounds like we want information to give the public fodder to file a tax appeal. I don't think that's our role. So and maybe I'm misunderstanding what some of the board members are saying, but I think if we're going to get a presentation, we better be focused on what type of presentation we're going to get. That's my concern.
I think what Mr. Becker was saying, and I have a similar concern when people ask me, I went down $10,000. Is that a good thing?
God bless you.
I have no idea whether that's a good thing for you. Because bottom line, Bob, correct me if I'm wrong, if I go down more than if my assessment went down more than 1.9%,
Correct.
then that's a good thing.
From a tax perspective, yes, sir.
And if my taxes either did not go down by 1.9%, and definitely if they went up,
Not
that's
taxes
really
value, right?
that's really an unfavorable thing for me personally.
From a tax payment perspective, yes.
And there's been nothing out there that has told the taxpayer that. So
Right.
I think, like what David's talking about, a matrix like that, at least questions like that could be fielded to a website. And maybe the tax assessor could put out a statement about what the general results were on the website.
And there's
Of
one
the
out
assessment.
there.
What?
There's one out there. Fairfield
Okay.
Tax, that's around
Right.
the organizations, but Fairfield Taxpayer put one out there, and theirs may be perfectly accurate, but oftentimes, it may or may not, we don't know, but it's a private organization doing that. So my question would be, if they can do it, why not the town? Not so much at that meeting, but more of we're having this meeting tonight. I mean, it'd be great if they could do it tomorrow, because what that does is, it brings a little bit of certainty, and it says the town is putting out this. And it's not about fodder, and it's not about appeals. It's about when there's information out there, when it comes, making sure people have accurate and information they can all feel confident about on a level playing field. And it seemed like the town was probably the best place.
Yeah.
maybe
And I'm not trying
to go into. That's
Yeah.
one
I'm not-
person's take.
Yeah,
I'm not
just-
trying to encourage tax appeals. What I'm trying to say is,
Not.
okay, these are the results, and say I accept the results. How is that going to impact me? This assessment. How is that going to impact me as a taxpayer individually?
Right.
Is it really bad? Is it not bad? Is it favorable? Somebody
Right.
should know that.
Yeah, just as a point of information, since people on TV may be watching us, the document that is out there that Mr. Becker is alluding to was certainly reviewed, edited, and changes made as a result of the town's review and analysis of that, and it is a correct document.
Okay. So in other words, the private organization vetted their document with the town,
Correct.
and the town said, by and large, this document
Oh.
is accurate.
No, we suggested some changes which were made,
And then it's accurate?
yes.
Okay. I want to address, because it was my view, piggybacking on Mrs. Leclerc, to have the presentation in the first place, so let me tell you where I thought it was going. Number one, I think it is appropriate for us to briefly review the process, because this board signed off on the process when we funded it. Okay, so a reminder of this is what the process was. Secondly, my view, I think it's important that we get an idea from the outside firm that we hired, lessons learned from the evaluation. So what did they do this time that maybe we didn't do well the last time? What are the major differences? provide the context to this board for, hey, here's what you got last time, these were the results, this is the impact. Here's what we did this time, this is what was different than what was done last time, these are the results, this is why we stand behind the results, this is why the results are the way they are. That way, when board members are out in public and are asked the questions, as the gentlemen are referring to, they have a context for which to provide, this was the process that was gone through. I think the matrix is a separate conversation, but should be available, and maybe on the town website, that might be a good idea, right? I don't know what it takes to get it on there, but so that people can get the information and basically do the analysis for themselves. Because quite frankly, I think they're going to do it anyway, or they're going to try to, and they're going to reach some conclusions. Last time, in the absence of that type of information, what was happening was people thought spending was going through the roof because there was some confusion over how the pie got divvied up. So it was, oh my God, my taxes went up 20%. You guys must have increased spending by 20%. Well, no, we didn't, but your share of it went up higher, and here's how that works. And that's a very difficult concept for people that aren't dealing with it on a day-to-day basis. That was my reason. That was my. Mr. Walsh?
I mean, the other reason to have the meeting is, the one number I've not really heard about is what the difference is between commercial and residential.
Right.
Because if the residential properties went down more than 1.9%, then they're shouldering less of the burden.
Correct.
And the residential people are shouldering more of the burden. And that's always an important factor, and something I think needs to get out there.
I agree. And that's one of the conclusions that should be discussed.
Yeah. The commercial was constant, I think.
It's what?
Flat. I think the commercial was flat, neither up nor down.
Which would mean they're shouldering more because the residential
Correct.
went down by 1.9.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot of pieces to the matrix.
Right, which is why having a discussion about it and putting it into broader context, I think
Yeah.
makes sense. So if we could follow up on that, I think that'd be important for all of us. Does everyone agree with that?
By virtue of the fact that it's presented here, it goes on the website anyway.
Yeah, fair enough.
I also would like to get it on the early January meeting.
We could?
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else? All right. Then I'm going to go to item number 5, and that's to hear a report on the fiscal year 2016 budget process from the Budget Subcommittee. At this point, I'm going to turn over to Mr. Brown. Oh,
electricity.
geez. I'm so sorry. I forgot about that. Gentlemen, please come on up. My apologies. Thank you, Mr. Matola.
Let's dodge that bullet.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I would say that do not pave Mr. Matola's road after that happened. Go ahead. Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for being here, and my apologies for not remembering. Go ahead.
Got lost in the crowd.
There you go, exactly.
Good evening, Joe Michelangelo, Director of Public Works. With me, Ed Bowman, Assistant Director of Public Works, who works with me on a lot of these energy accounts. The variance shows to the bad of $251,000 for electricity. And electricity isn't just one account, it's
Right.
accumulation of several different accounts. If you recall, at the end of last year, when our electricity account ran over, one of the things we attributed it to is when we built the budget, we failed to capture all of our energy opportunity payments. We probably have around 18 projects which we've done over the years, which it's a grant loan program with United Illuminating. And the way they work is they put up the capital to improve projects, we save electricity, and we repay them over a 3-year or 4-year period. So one of the things we did last year, which caused the overage, and once again, I think Mr. Flynn pointed it out, if you were wrong this year, did you fail to capture it for this year? And the answer was yes, and we come back with the number. So out of this projected overage, $102,000, we captured some of the energy opportunity programs, but we failed to capture every single monthly payment we have to make to repay those programs. So that attributes to about $102,000 of the overage in this estimate here. Another portion of the overage, and once again, these are quarterly, so some of these are, estimated, extrapolated by 4. But the fact that we have as you know, we've implemented about a dozen or so, well, not quite on the town side, about a half a dozen solar PV projects where we're able to produce electricity, buy electricity for in the 11, 12 cents range. When we buy it from UI, we're paying upwards of 18 and 19 cents. So when we built the budget, we programmed more of these projects online than came to fruition. Some of them will keep coming through the year. We have a number of them in the queue that will be online and will be getting reduced power, but we haven't realized that yet. So that is another reason why we're paying more in this budget than we shouldn't. It's not a major one, but because of the Fairfield Theater that has their separate line item, because they built their warehouse there, that is a slight increase in overage also for that electricity consumption. And one of the things that we prepared this report for Mrs. Bossi last week, and the other component, and this is somewhat favorable, one of the remaining component is the street light account, which is fairly substantial. The total line item is $694,000. When we prepared that report for Mrs. Bossi last week, I think we overestimated the overage in that portion of it. So that's some slightly good news that the overall $251,000 I think will be reduced because of the some of the further analysis of the streetlight account.
How much will it be reduced by?
That portion we projected about $138,000 over in our first blush, and I'll let Mr. Bowman.
Right now, I don't think it'll be over at all.
So we're going to pick up
But for
$138,000.
two reasons. One, when I projected the streetlight budget, I included more than just that. There's actually 29 different streetlight accounts, but 28 of them are actually picked up in Public Works. Only one is picked up here. I put them all in there, so there was like $50,000 more kilowatt hours in there that belong in Public Works rather than this line item.
Okay, so let me just, if my colleagues would indulge me for a minute, I want to make sure I have this right. So you guys you were reporting based on your analysis a $252,000 overage in electricity, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. About $102,000 of that was the ongoing error carried forward from prior years related to not including the cost of paying for some of the projects that had been done previously. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So that's $102,000. That left roughly $140,000 in an overage, which, Mr. Michelangelo, you had just indicated that some of that overage was due to the fact that you were assuming some of the more efficient energy projects would be online. They're coming on later, so you're having to buy more at the higher rates from UI right now.
That's also correct.
Okay. So, but also of that 140 overage, quote unquote, that's unexplained, right? Mr. Bowman, you're saying that 138 of that is going away?
Yeah, we had projected 138 overage just for street lighting.
And you're
That's
saying
all
that's
going
going
away.
away? So that would mean that our total overage is really $104,000. Is that a correct statement?
I don't think so.
I think it's 113.
Okay, 113. Okay, so 113. So that, said another way, 102 is the carryover of the previous year error that we have again, and $11,000 is due to having to pay UI for the electricity that we're not generating on our own because those projects aren't online. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
And the Fairfield Theater, a little bump from there, too.
Okay. So the total overage, as opposed to 252, is 113, of which 102 is a previously known item.
Correct.
I have that right? Does anybody have any questions on that item? Mr. Walsh? And then I'll go to Mr. Mottola.
The FTC, we have to pay all of their electricity?
Yes, we do. We have a solar project on the building now, which did recoup a good portion of that, but then they added the big addition and a new meter, which they're using more electricity than they're saving now, so.
Do we have additional revenues to cover that?
I don't have any idea how the revenue's coming from there.
Can we get a report maybe in January as the budget season's approaching in advance, what the complete amount of revenues is for that project and every single expense that we have for the previous year? So we have some idea of where we stand with that project. Especially with the fact that, you know, what might make sense is we do that number through June 30th of 15, and then maybe we see some of those numbers now that the warehouse has come online.
And Mr. Tetra?
When we put together the budget for fiscal 16, we estimated roughly when the warehouse would come on and roughly how many performances would be there. So yes, there's additional revenue. It might be a little on the conservative side in terms of what was in the budget, because we tried not to overestimate that. So it should be easy enough to take a look at what our costs are with respect to this year and also take a look at the revenue. But both those numbers were adjusted in the past. If you go through June 30th of 15, we have that. In fact, it was a couple years ago, I lobbied for breaking out the costs for this separately, and Mr. Flynn, I think you may remember that in the budget book, we broke it out once, and then we put it back under DPW as part of that, because it was felt that by the board that would be a better way to look at it. But so we tried to break those out to make it a little bit clearer in terms of
Yeah.
how we look at that.
I think we should break it, I mean, whether it's done in the budget or not, somehow keep track of it. Just like we break out every one of Jerry's P&Ls. Every project that Jerry has a P&L. And there's other things we do P&Ls for. I think we should have a P&L,
course.
the golf courses.
Yeah.
I think we should have a P&L for that building.
Yeah, I think we'd have to go back and look. I think it's two separate lineups. I think it's, and I don't remember the budget book exactly. Forgive me for that one, right off the top of my, still recovering from this cold.
Okay.
But the
You're
expense
presuming if
line-
you were recovered, you would remember?
the expense item for electricity is a separate line item, so that's easy to see.
Okay.
We could turn to the budget book today and see that.
Are we responsible for their heat,
I believe it's all covered as part of that, yes.
water,
All the utilities.
maintenance?
No.
No maintenance. No air conditioner compressors, no heating system, nothing.
We do some maintenance on the building, yes, we do.
Okay. All
Actually,
that's what I'm talking
basically,
about.
yeah.
I'm trying to see, I would like to see every cost that goes into that building versus every dollar revenue we get.
I think that's a reasonable request. Can we take a look at that, certainly before the next budget season, just so that we understand it better? Mr. Becker?
And with that, perhaps, because I know this has been an issue in the past, an update on where they are with their payments, if they're behind, or,
Believe for the last couple of years, their payments haven't been a problem.
okay.
Good.
And are we positive we're capturing all the revenue? I mean, we should see now with the warehouse, the revenue should be going up, right? Their ticket sales should be significantly higher, from what I understand.
We would hope.
Yeah, you won't see it necessarily in the budget. You'll see it going up in the budget revenues.
Yeah.
But because we did the budgets literally a year before the warehouse came online,
Mhm.
we were not overly aggressive in forecasting those revenues. That
Understand.
doesn't mean to say we won't get the money from an actual standpoint.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we'll do the analysis not based on the budget, based upon information.
Yeah, where we are. Let's do that for the next quarterly meeting if we could, please. Mr. DeWitt?
Mr. Walsh mentioned it quickly, the golf courses. Didn't we ask about this before? Because we've had this discussion about, I can't remember which one of the golf courses is.
We did it at the golf courses, and we have gotten
We
it
do.
at
We've
the
had
golf
P&L
courses.
statements for the golf courses for
Absolutely.
Smith. Okay.
And in fact, I think it's been a while, but we also did it at one point for the building as well, but that was a number of years ago, I believe. Yeah,
I'm
FTC.
going to plead a cold at the moment on that one.
We asked about it, I remember, and I think we did get an answer on that, but it was several years ago, and that's when the payment issue actually came up. We were apprised of the payment issue.
My last question in regards to electricity is any movement from UI in regards to doing LED lights for the street lights?
Yes, they actually have a program approved by Pura to do that. And when I checked that, we're not scheduled to 2019. And when I looked at trying to get an update on that, you'd have to buy out all the existing lights, pay them the lost revenue. It was like $1.5 million. So we'll wait to 2019.
It would cost us $1.5 million?
Ahead of time. If we want to buy out their existing lights before 2019.
Yeah.
You're paying for the cost of the lights, the loss of revenue, and the cost of removal of the lights and replacing the LEDs ahead of time.
So it'd be 1.9 million?
Yeah.
And is that including the savings on electricity?
No, that would be outright cost.
Okay. And then we'd have savings, but you don't think it's anywhere near that
Well,
cost?
the payback would be about 13 years.
Okay.
So I think the savings would, because the largest cost with the streetlights isn't electricity.
Yep.
So out of that 150,000 or whatever, we'd save about 100,000. So that's almost 20-year payback. I mean, we're paying $38,000 a month for rent and maintenance on the streetlights. So that's the 29.5 cents a kilowatt hour.
Right.
Very aggravating.
All right, any other questions on this item? Gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Sorry I forgot you. All right, we'll go to line item number 5. To hear a report on the fiscal year 16 budget process from the Budget Subcommittee. And now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you mentioned, the budget season will be upon us in 2 months or 10 weeks from now. So the purpose of this committee is to have a postmortem of the previous budget process, the previous years, which was 2015. And to have a postmortem, talk about what went well, what didn't go so well, and what the future actions are. And the people on this budget committee are Mr. DeWitt, Mr. Stone, and myself. We did solicit opinions from other board members on last year's budget process. And Mr. Tetro and I did have a moment to discuss this a couple weeks ago. And Mr. Tetro and I did review this particular document that's in front of you. Okay, so what I'd like to do is read the statement on what was good. The Budget Committee has implemented many improvements and recommendations over the last 8 years. These recommendations have been agreed upon by the Board of Finance and voted into practice. They have added value to the Board of Selectmen, the Board of Ed, and the RTM budget processes. While the committee continues to recommend monitoring the process, we agree at this time there are no specific recommendations to improve the process. Any thoughts on that, Mr. Chairman?
The only recommendation that I would come up with or ask the committee to consider is what the schedule of the departments ought to be. I think depending on what's going on in the departments and on what nights they're seeing, I think it's very valuable for you guys to take a look and see, which nights could we have done better. That's really, from my view,
Okay.
the
So,
biggest item.
so at this point, I'd like to just review the future actions, because that is addressed in there.
Okay.
Just future actions, to continue to monitor the budget process and report to the Board of Finance Chairman. To continue to start the meetings at 7:30, because at one point we moved them back to 7 o'clock, and then we brought them back to 7:30. To continue to meet on Tuesdays and Thursdays, except the week of March 14th, when we should meet on Tuesdays and Wednesday. That is St. Patty's Day. And the first selectman does have an engagement on that Monday. So we wouldn't meet Monday, Wednesday. We're suggesting meeting Tuesday, Wednesday, which is consistent with last year. To possibly rotate larger presentations to early in the season or the first night of the week. To continue to follow the 2015 budget schedule as follows. So below is just a summary of how last year's budget season went. First of all, if you remember, we had significant weather.
Yeah.
And we had to postpone various meetings. So we had to move the schedule around, but we did have it scheduled for Tuesdays and Thursdays, except for that 1 week. So the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance had 6 joint sessions, and they all ended before 11:30. Even though we were scheduled for 7, we still got them finished by 11:30. Now, the Board of Finance had executive budget session on 3/26, and we had public comment on 3/28. The Board of Selectmen had budget discussion the following Monday, March 30th. The Board of Selectmen then voted on Tuesday, March 31st. The Finance Department adjusted the budget on Wednesday, April 1st for the Board of Finance. The Board of Finance voted on April 2nd. And just a critical date, the Board of Finance has to vote 30 days before the RTM. So there's a draft, there is a draft calendar out that the Board of Selectmen has to see. And once that's reviewed and when it comes before this board, you'll see that it's back to having 7 joint sessions scheduled out for Tuesdays and Thursdays, except for that 1 week. But something that's different this year is Easter is March 27th, it's a week earlier. So this board will most likely, if we draft it, will end up voting on March 31st as opposed to April. But otherwise, it pretty much runs the same.
And it gives us 2 days between when the Board of Selectmen vote and when we have to vote so that the Finance Department can make and distribute the adjustments.
Well, the Board of Selectmen will deliberate on a Monday. They could vote on that Monday, but if they need another day, it's scheduled. There is a scheduled date to vote on that Tuesday. Wednesday, so then we have Wednesday, and then we would vote on Thursday.
Okay. Anybody have any questions, comments, concerns so far? Anything to add? Mr. DeWitt?
Just a comment about the presentations and in your comment before about larger presentations. We did implement changes over the last 8 years or so. If you remember, it literally was by the numbers. The lower numbers went first, and then we grouped them together. And we did put some thought into the organization that is in there now. I don't disagree with looking at that again, maybe making some recommendations, but I will say this. In the last 4 years, I won't go back any much more than that, I can't remember ever having executed the exact plan because somebody can't be there one night or so. Listen, the best laid plans, right?
Yeah, we got blown up last year because of weather.
Yeah, we got blown up because of weather, or somebody's out of town. A department head can't make it because of a conflict with a building committee, something like that. So, I don't say we shouldn't look at it again, but we have done this in the past, just for historical reference. And again, it's very fluid.
Yeah. Fair point. Thank you, Mr. DeWitt. Any other comments? Thank you for the work on this. Mr. Tetra, did you have any comments on this
Mr. Becker.
from the Board of Selectmen? I'm sorry, Mr. Becker, go ahead.
Did you guys on the committee mostly? Mine's been the mic's been a little bit off tonight over here. Did you guys look at anything other than kind of what we do here? Any other best practices in other towns, or
No.
just sort of say what we're doing is? And then the only thing is the workshop, not the public comment workshop, but where we have a meeting is kind of the executive budget meeting. It's usually a shorter night.
Yep.
A lot of times there's some follow-up there, but there isn't a deep discussion at that point. Has there been any consideration on moving that perhaps, or something along those lines on the front end? Perhaps when people first get it, initial thoughts kind of start bouncing, kind of bouncing ideas at that point, and then to sort of set the stage for all of the questions that come out. It's a little bit different, but it's an idea. I've heard that it's been done, not here, but others have done that. Because it seems like that meeting's always there, but there's not a lot that gets accomplished. And I'm not sure if maybe there's a way to make that sort of concept but more productive. And I throw it out, but
Now, I think that would have a different purpose, right, than the meeting, the executive session that we have at the end of the budget process to discuss any changes we may make. It also gives department heads the opportunity to hear us, if we're going to make some changes, for them, on the night of the budget, to come up and give their opinion. So that's really the purpose. If we're not going to make any changes, they know they don't have to prepare, but if we do mention, I mean, in fairness to them, that's the meeting where we would say, we are looking at this, right, publicly, and then they can come up on the night of the vote and give their own opinion.
Mr. DeWitt, did you have something to add to that?
My only other comment is that if we don't want the department heads, general public, to be forcing our agenda. Our agenda is set, there's a process, and the way you've explained it, where they come in at the beginning, after not having the discussions we would have had for 8 weeks or so, and then trying to interject, I afraid we would force changes to the process, and I certainly agree with Jim's points that that is a lot of times the only time the department heads, unless we've directly called them and said, hey, by the way, we're adjusting your budget, and their only opportunity, frankly, to come back and say, I don't agree, or I agree with your adjustment. So.
yeah, just looking at the hours or sort of the date that's there and thinking about the productivity and but I understand certainly at that front loaded that is something that we certainly don't want them driving the agenda for us.
Yeah. To your point, Mr. Becker, I think the last couple of years, that meeting has been less of an event, and I think that's driven by where we are in the budget at that point in time, because there has been previous years when that has actually been a relatively lengthy meeting. In fact, it was a meeting that was added
Right.
earlier in my tenure on the board, when there were many more follow-up items, number one, that needed to be followed up on by the finance department and brought back to the board for clarification. Number two, there were some relatively contentious issues that were discussed at that meeting. And we found that when we were trying to do it the night we were voting, it got to be a little frenetic. And that's the reason it was added at the time. That doesn't mean that what you're talking about, which I would agree with what Mr. Brown said, which would be a meeting with a separate purpose, than the meeting where we've gotten all the information, or presumably 95% of the information, and we're kind of tipping our hand and asking maybe some clarification and some follow-up items to help support a vote that would come a couple of nights later. But your point is very valid in the fact that the last couple of years that meeting has been less useful.
Yeah.
I'm concerned we'll take it out, and that's the year we'll need it.
Oh yeah, that's the flip side of it, of course.
Right.
So just
But
yeah,
that's
making
also
sure we're being productive
Yeah.
all around.
That's also the reason we have 7 budgeted meetings, because we'd had years where we couldn't get them in 7 meetings. So we made a decision, I think 3 years ago as a budget committee, and we said, listen, we're always going to budget for 7 meetings. Nobody's going to complain if you cut one. Adding one, which we had done a bunch of years ago, was very hard to jam into a schedule that's very compressed near the end.
That's true.
Right. So.
Gives us an extra night, too, if we need it.
Yeah.
Right.
Is that good?
Yeah. No. Thanks.
Is that everybody else? Thank you for the comment, and thank you for the work. Anybody else? Seeing none, I have a motion to adjourn. Oh, by the way, before I adjourn, some very happy news. We've got a new member of the Board of Finance family. We'd like to congratulate Dave Becker and his wife on the birth of his second daughter.
you.
Dave is currently looking for a house with more bathrooms.
Yeah, I was slouched over here sleeping. I don't know why. But
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
2 more to go and you'll match me.
Not that anyone's counting.
I'm not so sure. But.
All right, do I have a motion? Mr. DeWitt, second. Mr. Matola, all in favor of adjournment? Those opposed? Good night, everybody.